From Wall Street to the White House, this is the Larry Kudlow Show.
So, President-elect Donald Trump made, in my opinion, one of his most brilliant appointments announced yesterday. My friend Scott Bessent, who was a worldwide investor of some renown, a close Trump advisor during the campaign, and a person of enormously good common sense. First of all, Scott Bessent, welcome and congratulations, sir. Congratulations.
Thank you, Larry. And it is an honor to my first media appearance after being the Secretary of Treasury nominee to be with you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that very, very much. Scott, let's start out, for those listeners, and this is people around the country, give us your thoughts. What are the key pillars of President Trump's economic policy, please?
It's going to be, as no one knows better than you, reestablishing economic growth. So we're going to try to get real economic growth in excess of 3%, and I think we can do much better. I think he is going to start making very substantial noises about getting this out-of-control budget deficit down in a controlled fashion over the next 3 or 4 years, and then U.S. energy dominance. And I tell you that the feedback that I get, the cabinet team of Burgum and Wright at Interior and Energy is just getting huge kudos. So it's going to be growth, deregulation, and many times on your show, I have called it, we are going to reprivatize the economy.
Yes.
Biden-Harris is this out-of-control government spending, and we are going to bring that back to the private sector again, and it's going to be good for big companies, small companies, the lower earning quintiles, and the top's always done well. They can continue to do well, but this is really going to be for working Americans.
I've taken to calling it blue-collar boom, a blue-collar boom. If you get through with the tax cuts and the deregulation, as you're suggesting, and the lowering energy costs and so forth, you can get a blue-collar boom. I mean, these deregulation and tax cuts, I think they will really help the middle, working folks in the middle brackets, working folks in the lower income brackets, Scott Bessent, they're going to be huge beneficiaries, I think. Take-home pay will go up, hopefully.
Larry, I got to say, I had the privilege of being at President Trump's final 2 campaign stops of this incredible comeback campaign, one at the Duquesne Arena in Pittsburgh, and then the final one in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And in Pittsburgh, when you see the workers come out with their hard hats on, their vests, their families, this is really who President Trump speaks to. This is who he is, and I love that blue collar boom. And anything that I can do over the next 4 years, I was so moved by the sight of those folks in Pittsburgh and Grand Rapids that that's the new Republican Party. Who else but Donald Trump could build those folks and then bring in Silicon Valley and then you and me who are growth, and that it is quite a powerful coalition that I think we've got for this mandate for the next 4 years.
Well, Scott, that's very well put, by the way. I was scanning all the papers. You probably were too today. You've gotten some great early reviews because of your experience in financial markets and because of your common sense pro-growth positions. Let me ask you, Scott, you mentioned getting the deficit down, which is important. I think along the way you figured let's get it down to something like 3% of GDP instead of 7% of GDP. Correct me if I'm wrong. That would be a noble cause. Will you be working? My question is, will you be working with Elon and Vivek Ramaswamy and their project, which I simply call chopping down government, but it's going to have a lot to do with getting rid of unnecessary spending. You'd be working with those guys, Scott Bessent?
Yeah, and I've already been in touch with them. I've been in meetings with Elon, and Larry, if we just think about a very simple equation of G for government, the equals S minus T, spending minus taxes. Why do we think that the spending always has to be bigger than the revenues? So the idea that Donald Trump, Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy are going to tackle the S. I can tell you, I've been investing in the bond market for 35 years, and I think this is going to be something that the bond market hasn't ever seen. Well, so, if we can get that spending down and get the growth that you and I love up, the trajectory of the debt could be better than anyone could imagine.
And Scott, I think this is such an underrated factor. In other words, I keep reading, and I'm sure you're reading the same articles, that Trump economic policies are going to increase inflation, or the Trump economic policies are going to increase the deficit, and that's going to increase inflation. They do not, the same articles never mention Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, and the whole effort to bring down S, as you call it, federal spending. They never mention that, which would be an enormous boon, and is counterinflationary because look at the Biden spending. The Biden spending was one of the major factors in the record high inflation, was it not?
It was the Biden spending that was quasi-financed by the Fed.
Yes,
because Larry, a tariff. You and I need to have an economics class for some of these folks who say tariffs are inflationary. Well, tariffs can't be inflationary because if the price of one thing goes up, unless you give people more money, then they have less money to spend on the other thing. So there is no inflation. The inflation comes through either increase in the money supply or increase in the government spending, and that's what happened under Biden. So it's economics 101. But I think this is exciting. It's something we haven't seen. I've seen mainstream press, and smart people, Bloomberg, Washington Post, are saying, well, there are always these government commissions, and they never work. And I went back and looked at the Clinton-Gore, Better Government Commission. It was a bunch of business school professors. It wasn't practitioners, and these are the greatest practitioners in the world.
Yeah, well, look what Elon did with with Twitter X. I mean, he talked about efficiency. Why don't you start there? He slash 90% of the staff, and he's made a better product of it so far. I mean, I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
No. And Larry, I think the other thing that is underrated is going to be the financial services deregulation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've taught these classes. I may seem like a super exciting guy, but my first job was as a banks and insurance analyst, so I know how these work. In the past couple of weeks, I've spoken to the CEOs of some of the biggest financial institutions in America, and they are ready to have a responsible lending boom, and they are so constrained by these regulators, who are harassing. They've had supervisory failures like with Silicon Valley Bank, so they want to put on more regulations. We need fewer regulations and better supervision. So, and everyone asks me, well, how much could the Doge Commission / Musk Commission cost? And I just say, I have a very simple mental model. Florida and New York have roughly the same population. Florida has slightly more, but let's call it 30 million people. New York budget is roughly 230 to 235 billion. Ron DeSantis runs Florida for about 115 billion. I've lived in both, and Florida gives you a better bundle of goods and services for your tax dollars than the state of New York does, and Florida doesn't even have an income tax. So how is Florida run for half of the price in New York?
So I think, Scott, are you still there?
I am, Larry.
I was going to add to that. I love that comparison, by the way. if you live in New York City, city and state taxes come to about 15%, just short of 15%. If you live in Miami, Florida, city and state income taxes come to zero. And yet, as you pointed out, Florida spends about half as much as what New York spends. So that's a good model for the federal government.
Yeah, and look, roads are better. You go and I don't know, when I went to the DMV in Manhattan, it was like going to some Kafkaesque nightmare. I didn't know whether it was going to take 30 minutes or 5 hours. I'm in and out in Florida in 20 minutes, and the folks behind the counter had a smile and couldn't be more efficient.
Wow. Scott, I got to take commercial break. Can you just give us another short segment after this? A couple more things to talk about. We're so grateful that you've chosen us to give your inaugural interview. And again, I want to say congratulations. You've become a great friend in the last year or so. Folks, we're going to take a quick break. Treasury Secretary-designate Scott Bessent will come right back after this. I'm Kudlow. Stick around.
Larry Kudlow. Now, back to the Larry Kudlow Show.
We are talking to President-elect Trump's U.S. Treasury Secretary-designate, the brilliant Scott Bessent, who has given us some time right after the announcement of last evening, and we're delighted to have him. Scott, thank you for a little more time. Then we'll get you out of there. I know you're a busy fella. I want to talk to you about a couple of things. One is that during the campaign, President Trump talked frequently about maintaining the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and I know you yourself have spoken about that. Could you tell us a little bit more, please?
Well, Larry, I was excited and not surprised at all yesterday when he and his comms team were drafting my announcement as Treasury Secretary-designate that he wanted to include, there's a big line in there. I'm not going to get the exact wording right, but Scott will work with me to maintain the U.S. dollar, the reserve currency status, and that is unquestioned. Unquestioned. So for any of those who've been negative on President Trump's stance on the dollar, he had made it very clear at the Economic Club of New York speech back in October, which I think you had made a lot of contributions to that speech, as did I. And then yesterday, first thing he said to me was, we are going to keep the dollar as a reserve currency, and we are going to strengthen its position by doing smart sanctions and not these forever sanctions that drive people out of the dollar.
I think people don't pay attention to that. It's so funny. A lot of critics, they say stuff about Trump. They don't listen to what he says. And as you noted, he said this throughout the campaign. He said at the New York Economic Club speech. You and I were sitting up there on the dais, Malpass, a few others, Paulson. I mean, he means it. I mean, look, I heard him in the first term when I was at NEC. I heard him say exactly the same thing. He wants the dollar to remain the world's reserve currency. I call it King Dollar. I have for decades. And I think that's a huge plus. You're not going to launch inflation. You're not going to end the value of our currency if you want the dollar to be maintained as the world's reserve currency. And I think, you know what, Scott, that fits with America first. And I've said this to him many times. You want this country to be great again. You want America first. Then you have to have a great currency. And he understands that. He's always understood that, even though his critics don't, Scott Bessent.
Well, Larry, the market's a voting machine, and we have had a tremendous upward move in the strength of the dollar since the night of November 5th when Donald Trump won. Mm-hmm. So global investors are voting. I had the privilege in the past 10 months to get to know your old friend, Art Laffer.
Yep.
And at one point, I said, Art, I was a college student in the 80s. And everyone was going on and on about the dual deficits and the dollar is going to collapse. And I said, why was the dollar so strong in the 80s? And he said, Scott, it's very simple. When you increase the after-tax return on assets in a country, capital flows in. And everything you and I have just talked about the Trump agenda for the next 4 years is going to increase after-tax the returns on assets with cheap energy, the deregulation, and a growth mindset that everyone in the world is going to want a piece of that.
Yes, well, look what this...
and also currencies are a relative game. Look what's happening in Europe. Look what's happening in China. Look what's happening in Japan. So we are, as you said, king dollar.
Listen, look at what the markets have done, Scott. The stock market has exploded since the election night. Now, you know as well as anybody, you're an expert investor. Markets fluctuate, but the fact is they call it the Trump trade. They call it the Trump rally for a good reason. And you just laid it out. That is to say, after tax, after inflation returns to U.S. assets are going to go up under his plans. You couldn't ask for anything better. That's consistent with your idea that we want to get back to 3% economic growth. Same consistency running through all these policies. Scott Bessent, just the last few moments. On the tax cuts, can you get that? I think that it would be wise to move on the legislative calendar. I mean, there's, regulatory stuff is more executive branch. The immigration close the border stuff is more executive branch, but the tax cuts are going to require legislation. I think I'm going to ask you, and maybe it's too soon to conclude, but I think it'd be good to get going on that right away. Let's make the tax cuts, one of the early, if not the earliest, priority in the Congress. Scott Bessent.
Larry, last night I believe I thanked you. When I texted you, I called my spouse, I called my children, I called my two home state senators who've been very supportive, Lindsey Graham and Tim Scott. And then I immediately started receiving texts from the most important legislatures in both houses, the House and the Senate, on the tax bill and getting it going and how important it is. So, I got 2 hours of euphoria, and then at 7:30, sitting in a quiet room in Mar-a-Lago, I already got to work on it.
Yes.
So it started last night.
Well, that's great. By the way, I want to tell you, my friend Mike Crapo, who's going to be the Senate Finance Committee chairman, he's fabulous, Scott Bessent. Crapo is he's a brilliant guy. He's terribly underrated. I've known him for many years, senator from Idaho. I think he went to Harvard Law School at one point. But I'm just saying he's a genius on this fiscal stuff, Scott. You're going to love working with him.
Larry, that's who I'm talking about. His was one of the first text messages in the door.
Oh, good.
And to prove that we can do bipartisan work, this Yale man is going to work with that double Harvard guy as hard as I can.
Okay, I love that. Last one, the 333, let's see, 3% deficit share of GDP, 3% growth plus, which I love, and we can get 3 million more barrels out a year, huh? That would get us about 16 and a half, 17 million barrels a day.
Well, Larry, those are barrel equivalents. So right now we have about 21 million barrel equivalents. So that's, nat gas, other liquids.
Yes.
So 3 would be about a 15% increase. And by the way, the Biden-Harris administration, we're supposed to be up 1.5 million barrels from 2020 to 2024, and we're basically flat. So, half of that is just making up for what they stymied, and then the other half is just reopening the fields, not attacking them through the regulatory state. And I think we're going to have what's going to be in my mind, the most important is the energy infrastructure build out,
Right.
The pipelines, and then we'll also do the electric transmission grids. So, unlike a lot of countries like China that suppress wages, U.S., we have a free market in wages, but we have the most abundant energy sources.
Yes.
So we're going to compete on energy, and then we'll get real wage growth for working people, like you said, a blue-collar boom.
Yep.
And that's going to be driven by the energy policy.
Scott Bessent, U.S. Treasury designate. You can hear he's a brilliant guy. He's thought this thing through, working for President Trump. Thank you ever so much, Scott Bessent. We appreciate it. Folks, I'm Kudlow. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
If you're a maintenance supervisor for a commercial property, you've had to deal with everything from leaky faucets to flickering light bulbs. But nothing's worse than that ancient boiler that's lived in the building since the day it was built, 50 years ago. It's enough to make anyone lose their cool. That's where Grainger comes in. With industrial-grade products and dependable fast delivery, Grainger can help with any challenge, from worn-out components to everyday necessities. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.